Suicide bombings streamed over the internet. Massive explosions triggered by the keys of a cell phone. Beheadings videotaped and sold on DVDs in open-air markets. Today's changing world has provided numerous new opportunities for those bent on destruction. In a war of ideas, technology plays no favorites. It's a trend that terrorists have capitalized in their battle against the West. They know they can find supporters at the click of a mouse. How do you combat such increasingly sophisticated and media-savvy tactics? The U.S., some say, has been slow to adapt. Images depicting inhumane treatment at Abu Ghraib, for example, traveled around the world at the speed of light, with catastrophic consequences for America's image. The impact of public diplomacy efforts have been limited at best. Early efforts were criticized for their reliance on Madison Avenue. Terrorism, technology, and the battle of ideas coming up next on Great Decisions 2007.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and U.S. Trust.
Now from our New York studios, here is John Donvan.
I'm John Donvan of ABC News, and welcome to Great Decisions 2007. Joining me to discuss terrorism, technology, and the battle of ideas are Bruce Hoffman, professor of security studies at Georgetown University and author of Inside Terrorism. Also Max Boot, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of War Made New, Technology, Warfare, and the Course of History. And the title of both of your books suggests that you're both acknowledging we're in a new era when it comes to, I would say, the nature of the enemy, the tools they have, and our ability to fight back against them, new vulnerabilities. Let's talk about, in the beginning, the term terrorism and terrorist as we understand it in the year 2007. Do we even need a definition of that word, or are we past the point where that's even a relevant issue? Bruce?
Well, I think we do need a definition because it's the kind of word that's been bandied about, often with very little understanding, and become more a label than anything else. But I think it's enormously important to call the phenomena what it is and to call the perpetrators what they are. And that is the use of violence or the threat of violence for political purposes designed to have a profound impact, not just on the actual victim, but on a watching target audience.
Max, what about you? Your definition of terrorism?
Well, my definition is very similar to Bruce's. In fact, if you read his excellent book, you can see that there are many debates over definitions of terrorism itself, but I think, it's like obscenity. You sort of know it when you see it, and I don't think we need to worry too much about defining the term itself. What we really need to worry about is what do we do about it, how do we combat it? That's our real problem today, and that's where we're paying a grave price for not being better prepared.
Is it relevant at least to try to calculate whether your enemy, we use the term terrorism actually to define the enemy in much broader terms than simply the technique that they use, which is terrorism. Are we in a world where the word terrorist defines not just the technique, but actually the philosophy and the goals of the enemy that we're fighting?
Well, it certainly defines the philosophy because I think part and parcel of what terrorism is about is it's a form of violent communication. Mm-hmm. And that terrorists exist to use communication as a means to impart that sense of fear and anxiety and to make it so profound that the target audience, or whether it's governments, whether it's a society and a population, will be moved to accede to the terrorist demands or to desist from certain policies that the terrorists impose. So I think the psychological impact makes it enormously important that that's part of the key to understanding how effective it is as a weapon.
There's often a notion, I think, as the word is used now, of a terrorist is irrational, bordering on insane, which leaves us as the adversary in the position of working against an enemy that we cannot negotiate with, that we can't find any sort of rational middle ground with. And I want to know, Max, do you think that that's useful and that that's fair and that that's accurate, particularly in dealing with the breed of terrorists that we're dealing with now, Al-Qaeda?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that some terrorists are in fact irrational, but those tend to be sort of the lower level foot soldiers, the people who are actually strapping on the suicide belts. When you're dealing at the higher level, people like Osama bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri, they're very smart people. They're very smart in terms of calculating what they want to do and how they go about doing it. Now, their ultimate aims may strike us as being mad in the same way that Hitler's or Lenin's ultimate aims may have been mad, but nevertheless, they're extremely cunning about carrying out their policies and often coming up with ingenious ways of attacking us. I mean, who would have thought that you could use box cutters and 19 men to kill 3,000 Americans? That's a tremendously sophisticated plot hatched by people who we think of as being irrational, fanatical, crazy, and so forth, but in fact, and all those terms apply in some sense, but they're also cunning and smart, and we have to recognize that if we're going to counter them.
If our enemy, for example, in a previous war were fighting us with ballistic missiles, we would counter with ballistic missiles. That would be the calculation that we would make. Nevertheless, we wouldn't necessarily call our enemy the ballistic missile people. Terrorism, it's different. They're using a technique, and we use that term actually to define who they are.
Well, some of that is, I think, just sort of politically correct expediency, because our government officials are afraid of saying that what we're really fighting is one brand of terrorism being perpetrated by Islamist terrorist groups, those who are pursuing this extreme version of Islamic ideology promulgated by people like bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and others, because they don't want to set up this clash of civilizations. Therefore, they talk about, in a more anodyne fashion, about we're fighting terrorism, although President Bush has started to say that the enemy is Islamofascism. And I think it's clear we're not fighting all terrorists equally. Although we oppose all terrorists, we're not going to commit a lot of resources to fighting the IRA or the Basque separatists. There's a lot of terrorist groups in the world. The ones who are killing Americans or may kill Americans, the ones who pose a lethal threat to our way of life, are the Islamist terrorist groups, and those are the ones we're directing our energy against.
Moving into and through 2007, how do you think it's going, what we're now calling the war on terror and the war on terrorism? Who's winning, who's losing, or can you even calculate it that way? Bruce?
I think that we've done remarkably well tactically. I think in beating back al-Qaeda and diminishing its power and depriving it of its operational camps, its training bases, its command and control headquarters in countries like Afghanistan. But I think this is the fundamental challenge, as well as we've done tactically in reducing al-Qaeda's capabilities. I think strategically we're falling behind. In other words, we're being very effective with the current generation of terrorists. I think we've been less effective, as an estimate that was made by the National Intelligence Council, for example, in 2006 concluded that unfortunately we're radicalizing perhaps even more potential fighters, potential terrorists. So we're doing well against this generation, but I think the fundamental challenge we face is against the next generation, people growing up in North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia today, and even more so, the generation after next, those who are growing up in those same countries that already have an enormous youth bulge, that already have challenges in terms of finding jobs for people, providing them with education, and so on. So that, unfortunately, I think we're at the tip of the iceberg.
Are you saying, Bruce, that the tactical successes of the present day actually are the cause of the strategic failure in the longer run, that by killing bin Laden and his colleagues now, we're radicalizing the next generation?
No. I'm saying that I don't think inappropriately either the first 5 years of the war on terrorism have focused on killing and capturing terrorists. And that's absolutely essential. It has to continue. But I think what we're realizing now, and what the release of the new national strategy to combat terrorism, when it was released in September 2006, showed, is that we need a much richer mix, not just of the kinetics, not just of force. We can't dispense with that, but we need to bring in a much richer mix of public diplomacy, information operations, economic development, political reform, and so on. In other words, much more of what might be stereotypically called a hearts and minds campaign.
Right. And if I just to pick up on the point that Bruce is making, I think what we're seeing is really the limitations of conventional American combat power, because we have this amazing technology and these amazing men and women in the armed forces. We can hit a target anywhere in the world in a very short span of time. And we have done that very effectively, taking out individual terrorists such as Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. The problem that we find is the one that Bruce alludes to, which is that you can kill individual insurgents, but you can't necessarily defeat the insurgency as a whole by killing those individuals. And in fact, some of our kinetic actions may backfire against us. And just to give you one example of that, I think back to the first offensive in Fallujah, Iraq, in April of 2004, where we tried to take the city. The Marines were fighting their way into the city when all of a sudden the offensive was called off. And why was it called off? Not because the Marines were being defeated by the terrorists that they were facing, but because of this horrific news coverage that was going out all over the world on Al Jazeera and other networks, which was showing purported American atrocities. And this led to the concern in Baghdad and Washington that we were losing the public relations fight, so we had to call off the Marines. And I thought Lieutenant General Jim Conway, who was the Marine commander there, had a very telling comment where he said, "We got our butts kicked by Al Jazeera." Now just think about that, think about what that says about the world we're in, where some of our toughest fighting men are defeated not by other fighting men, but by a television network. This is the kind of battlefield we face in the future, and there's not an easy solution in a way that there's no way we can easily apply our conventional military might to solve that problem.
Also our values. I mean, if we believe in the notion of free and open media, Al Jazeera, whether you like it or not, is part of the media, and I suppose those commanders would have had the option of throwing Al Jazeera out the first time and didn't do it. Are we able, actually, and this is a central question, it has been throughout 2006 and will be throughout 2007, are we able to fight against the war on terrorism and stay true to our values, not just on issues of media coverage, issues of torture and the Geneva Conventions, the way we conduct our judicial system? Do we have to make compromises in order to successfully win the fight?
I don't think so, but I think we have to do better, as Max, I think, has very accurately just described in the case of Fallujah, but writ large in countering the insurgent and terrorist propaganda. I think the big challenge we're going to face in the future isn't so much even the Al Jazeeras. It isn't established television networks anywhere in the world. It's the fact that terrorist insurgents are now using their own television stations, their own means of communication through the internet, through selling DVDs, to actually completely bypass media and still be able to communicate with their audiences.
Take us through a bazaar where they're selling DVDs, and what's on offer there?
Well, in many cases, they're the almost coarsest type of political snuff films, as it were. It shows in great graphic detail the beheading, for instance, of Nicholas Berg, the young American who was killed in May 2004.
You can buy this on the street.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you can download it from the internet as well, just as easily. I mean, that's the problem, is you can buy them on the street, but they're also available to a worldwide audience. In many instances, there are videos and DVDs that are more or less how-to or instructional devices that show attacks on American and coalition forces in Iraq. I've seen one, for example, that shows how to set up remote-controlled mortars and how to cut holes in the ceilings of an abandoned building and then camouflage it so that helicopters or UAVs or any kind of aircraft flying overhead can't see these emplacements, and then how to detonate them remotely.
And people are buying these things.
They're buying them, they're downloading from the from the internet, and they're sharing them.
And what does that say, Max, that there's a market? I mean, in a way, when you're talking about controlling and countering the propaganda, we're both talking about the source, but now we're talking about the consumers. If there's a market out there for this already, does that not say that we have an enormously difficult job in trying to sell the message to people that they're not really, at this point, apparently interested in hearing?
Well, I think we do have a challenge, but we shouldn't infuse al-Qaeda and our enemies with superhuman powers. A lot of the things they do also backfire. And in fact, they've had problems in Iraq where they've become unpopular, and they've lost popularity throughout the Muslim world. If you look at public opinion polling over the last 4 or 5 years, largely because they've been killing so many fellow Muslims, which is not a good public relations move. And so you've had letters going back and forth between Ayman al-Zawahiri and the terrorists in Iraq saying, guys, cool a little bit, be a little bit more discriminating in what you're doing, because they suffer public relations hits as well. But the problem that we face in this kind of battle, John, is really that we have this great regard for human life. We have our liberal values, which I absolutely applaud. I share those as well. But they don't have those values, and they take advantage of our sensitivities in order to fight against us. And you saw this happen last summer in the war in Lebanon, for example, where Israel was fighting the same kind of enemy that we face in Iraq or Afghanistan in the form of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah kept playing up the civilian casualties that were being created by Israeli airstrikes. And why were those civilian casualties being created? Because Hezbollah very deliberately places their rockets in civilian neighborhoods, because they know that liberal powers like Israel and the United States will be reluctant to bomb those areas. And if they do bomb them, it's going to cause public relations carnage. It's going to cause a huge backfire in the media war that those folks are waging against us. And neither Israel nor the United States nor other Western powers have a very good answer for dealing with these folks who play upon our own liberal sensitivities. They don't have any compunctions about risking the lives of their own civilians.
What about Israel? What about the Israelis simply telling the story, simply explaining? And I know they did this. I was covering the Israeli side of this. I know they did this, that the Israelis did go out and say, look, Hezbollah's hiding in hospitals and in villages, and there are missiles in people's garages, and when we take them out, people who stay in their houses are going to die. And the Israelis put that story out. But the image doesn't... The image of the catastrophe is so much more powerful than a spokesman in Jerusalem telling a story.
Especially when it's repeated 24/7 over and over again.
Or when you have live feeds, for instance, on Al-Manar, Hezbollah's TV station, a terrorist organization that has its own 24/7 television station where they're showing live feeds of bombing, destruction of civilians just on a continuous loop that's then picked up by Al Jazeera, that's then picked up by other networks, and just repeatedly show scenes of bloodshed and carnage, but the same scenes over and over again.
So what's the pushback for us in this war? You've described a pretty bleak and difficult challenge. How do we come back to it?
Well, I don't think we've begun to fight it, and that's why I think it's so enormously important that we're recognizing that we can't solve this problem with military force or with the force of arms alone. For example, there's in excess of 5,000 insurgent and terrorist websites on the internet, and we do very little to counter that. In fact, only about 6% of the Voice of America's budget, overseas budget, is dedicated to internet communications. And that's not to say that it's not important to concentrate as they have been on television, radio, and the print media. But if most of the people, if most of the target audience we seek to reach is not getting their information from TV, from radio, from newspapers, much like young people in our own country, then we're obviously missing a very important segment when only a small fraction of their efforts and their budgets and their resources is dedicated towards internet communication. So partly it's entering the playing field. It's realizing that the war...
Putting up 5,000 websites, or at least putting up some websites?
I think first and foremost, just as Max described, I mean, you don't have to be truthful on the internet. Many of these terrorist and insurgent groups propagate almost the coarsest and most base conspiracy theories, things that we just dismiss with a wave of a hand and think are ridiculous. But they've become so pervasive, these sites that purvey these conspiracy theories, and so ubiquitous, that they're assuming a veracity and a truth that's divorced from reality, and we're not countering it. So we're allowing these conspiracy theories to become the lingua franca of political discourse in many parts of the world.
Max, if we were to push back in the way that Bruce is talking about, who's the audience? You've got to imagine that the kids who are in the madrasas, who become teenagers out of the madrasas, aren't going to listen to anything that we say. They cannot. Their minds most likely cannot be changed at that point. So whose hearts and minds are we trying to affect when we talk about pushing back in a propaganda fashion? Well,
there definitely are people who are so radicalized we're never going to reach them, but that's not true of the entire Muslim world. In fact, I think most Muslims are sort of on the fence, and they can be reached. But in order to reach them effectively, we have to dramatically change the way our government does business. And what Bruce was talking about is one example of that, but I think it goes much broader than that. In my book, War Made New, I talk about revolutions in military affairs, periods when radical changes in military technology and tactics combine to transform the playing field. And I think we're in one of those periods right now, the information revolution. And one of the points that I gleaned from a study of 500 years of history is that in order to master one of these revolutions in military affairs, you have to fundamentally change your governmental structure. And we haven't really done that because we have this vertical, industrial age, hierarchical government in this information age when decentralized network organizations are much more powerful than they ever have been in the past. And we need to do some of the things in our government that successful corporations, whether Walmart or Microsoft or Dell or others have done, in order to flatten hierarchies, empower individuals, and in the case of our government, to adapt from simply fighting mirror image adversaries like the Republican Guard to dealing with these kinds of unconventional opponents such as Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah or others.
What would that mean in practical terms? You mean a consular official somewhere out in Indonesia would have more power to simply make some decisions that he's going to go out and talk to some people on the street and not have to get clearance, not have to go with talking points, but just go with what he's learning and what his guts are telling him is going to apply to the situation. You're talking about that kind of a truly elemental change in
that's
empowerment?
part of it. I mean, there are a lot of changes. I mean, the State Department, for example, is starting to implement some of these changes, such as, for example, simply getting more officials who speak Arabic and can communicate to the audiences we're trying to reach, and also to change where people are based, because traditionally we've had lots of people based in big countries like Germany and Britain, and very few in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, which are on the front lines of this war on terrorism. So we have to shift resources to the new battlefields. And I think but I think one of the big changes in the information age is that it really empowers individuals, whether that's bond traders or terrorists. And we have to empower our own individuals so that they don't have to constantly buck decisions up to Washington, so that they can have the power to decide on the spot and counter what we're facing. Just to give you one example of that, if I could,
sure.
With the problem that we face with IEDs, improvised explosive devices in Iraq, which have been taking this steady toll on American forces, and we keep responding to it. But every time we respond to something, they change what they're doing, and they change what they're doing faster than we can respond because they don't have to go through this procurement bureaucracy. They don't have to report to Congress. They simply find new ways to blow up Americans, and we're always one step behind in figuring out how to respond to that.
All right, let's say we figure out the how to respond, and we put up the websites, and we increase broadcasting like Amanar programs like that going into these countries. What essentially is the counter message to say a population that is steeped in fundamentalism, surrounded by hostility towards the U.S., no real alternate point of view, all of this exacerbated by poverty and a sense of resentment? What's our message that can turn the tide in this?
Well, I think, in fact, we don't know that, and that's part of the problem. Is that we've deigned to think that we know it. And the mirror imaging that Max just described in terms of military operations, I think we've also done with information operations, that we've portrayed and seen things too much through an American prism. Mm-hmm. We really have to understand our adversary and understand the target audience we want to reach much better. Let me give you an example. During the Vietnam War, for example, there was a massive effort that involved interviewing of thousands of Viet Cong detainees in the early 1960s that built up a comprehensive picture of their morale and motivation, of the fissures and the dissension within their organizations, of the issues that they cared about, of the issues that they had disputes over. And then we could devise messages that identified these schisms or fault lines and drove deeper wedges within the organizations. Or we had very targeted messages that reflected what we were learning from them. We did the same thing during the Cold War. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty interviewed literally hundreds of thousands of people who either traveled to or fled from the Iron Curtain. We built up a complete database and knowledge of what the key issues were and what the most effective messages were. And then we devised an information operation that targeted that. We've done too much, I think, to date based on conjecture and that have viewed the problem through an American prism.
One advantage that Radio Free Europe had, though, in the 50s and the 60s was they were playing to a population that was already entirely cynical about its own leadership, in many cases hated its own leadership, did not believe its own leadership. Do we have... We may have that advantage in regard to Egyptians and what they think of Egyptian state television, but do we have that advantage when it comes to a radicalized Egyptian reading his news off of a website? They tend to trust, I understand, they tend to trust the propaganda from their side, as opposed to a Czech or a Pole who absolutely didn't believe and was seeking alternative information and willing to take the risk to listen to a U.S. broadcast late at night. Do we have that advantage this time?
Well, it's almost worse than that. State Department polls have showed that in Jordan, moderate country, one of our strongest allies in the region, at times of crisis, one of the preferred media outlets for the Jordanian listening and viewing population is Al-Manar, is Hezbollah's TV station. So you're absolutely right. It's an apples and oranges comparison in the sense that we have a huge mountain really to climb, that we're very far behind. But at the same time, I would argue we just fundamentally haven't started to do this. And it's not only something that the United States should be doing. We should be empowering and building this capacity in Egypt, in Jordan, in Yemen, in various other countries. But we're really falling short, I think, from even beginning the process. And therefore, we think that it's an insurmountable hurdle or problem.
And Max, do you think it's insurmountable, or do you think it's something, as Bruce says, we just haven't started to really take on?
I don't think it's insurmountable. I agree with Bruce that it's going to be a long-term project, and we're just at the early stages of it. But when you think about what the other side is selling, in the end, I don't think it's an ideology that most people are going to buy, because even in places like Afghanistan or Iran, where extreme Islamists have come to power, they've tended to be very unpopular. Their own people have turned against them because very few people want to live this rigid life with the officials, these guardians of official morality telling them what to do. That's not what people want. But people in the Middle East, I think, are chafing at the lack of opportunity they currently have, the lack of economic opportunity, the lack of political opportunity, because they live in these stagnant dictatorships which can repress dissent but can't deliver basic social services. And we have a tremendous model to offer these folks, I think. We don't have to say it's the United States model, but it's the model of freedom, which has been more successful than any other organizing principle for government that we've ever seen. So the question is, how do we sell them on the notion that a freer, more liberal society will make them happier and deliver the justice they seek, rather than the kind of utopian, extreme Islamist theology that is being preached to them by so many people on Al Jazeera or Al-Manar or these other stations? I don't think it's an impossible problem. In fact, polls show that most people in the Middle East are very skeptical of these extreme radicals, but we're not really competing very effectively with them. So I think if we can do a better job of getting our message out there, and not just our message, but also by showing with our actions that we are actually concerned about the welfare of these folks, that it's not just talk, but we're backing up with action, with concern, for example, about the things that the Saudi royal family is doing, or Hosni Mubarak to repress their own people. I think we have a chance to at least compete on the information front over the long term.
All of which may scare our allies to death, won't it, Bruce? Mubarak and the Saudi family, and we have about 20 seconds.
Well, I think, again, if we understand our target audience and if we understand our enemy, our messages and the messages of our allies will be that much more effective, but we really haven't begun that process yet.
Bruce Hoffman, Max Boot, thanks very much. I'm John Donovan. Thank you for joining us with Great Decisions 2007.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and U.S. Trust.